really conscious that amongst the audience, there's a wide range of roles and a wide range of settings in which you're working, both local authorities, schools, MATs, etc. So I hope that what I have to say has some resonance and is useful to you in some form. I'm conscious some of it will be really familiar, and perhaps other parts just a refreshment of things you already know. I'm going to talk about making placements work from the perspective of 3 children and how we, in our different roles, wherever we work, can help the children and bear their perspective in mind in developing strategy and plans. And I'm going to give a quick update about government developments around SEND and inclusion. So thanks, Chris. We go on to the next slide. And to say my perspective comes from having worked in schools for over 30 years. The last 10 years of my work in schools was as a head teacher of a Hackney comprehensive school, which I aimed to be as inclusive as possible. I was then Director of Education for the London Borough of Hackney for 4 years, and then Interim Director for Plymouth City Council for a year. So in those director roles, I line managed SEND. So I'm not an expert in great detail, but I really have a broad view of that provision for our children with SEND. And some of that work included aiming to enable schools to become more inclusive, and I'll come back to that with the government information at the end, and work to assure special school placements. Thanks, Chris. You go on. And so let's think about children's perspectives, and of course that should always be informing our strategy, our vision, our aims and our long-term approach, but also sometimes just thinking about what's it like from the child's perspective can just help us with solving day-to-day issues. Thanks, Chris. So I'm going to talk about 3 children. These aren't their real names, but they are children whose type you will probably have come across. So we've called this little boy Alfie. He's 9 years old. He's in foster care. He's still in touch with his birth mother, and she's just had twins. And he's had an EHCP since starting at primary school for SEMH, including ADHD. So without sort of appropriate support and adaptations, he struggles to make progress in his classroom. But skilled teachers would be able to absolutely support Alfie, and he gets some additional support. He's attending a mainstream primary school. It's his 2nd primary school because he moved primary schools before, and he does spend some time in the nurture unit there. So he's age 9, so he's got 2 more years at primary before making that transition to secondary, and we'll bear that in mind thinking about his secondary placement. Thanks, Chris. And if we go on to our next child, who's Brenda. Brenda's not her real name. Brenda's 13 years old, and she lives with her birth parents. Brenda started avoiding school in the latter part of year 7. She really managed well at primary school, but year 7 was tricky, and she became anxious, and later on in year 8 she was diagnosed with autism. She's now missed a significant amount of school. School has quite inflexible behaviour policies. Brenda, again, should be able to be in mainstream school. School has an on-site AP unit, alternative provision unit, which Brenda attends, and this smaller unit with fewer children, fewer staff around is helping her return to school. Thanks, Chris. And this is Amina, again, not her real name. Amina's 6, and Amina has complex physical needs and learning difficulties. She attends an all-through special school. And Amina lives with her birth parents who work part-time in the medical profession. So again, thinking about the future for Amina, she's probably well set up for the next few years. It's an all-through school that is providing well for her needs. Thanks, Chris. If we go on to the next slide. So just thinking about what works for these children from their perspective. And for all 3 of them, so we go back, stability, safety, and being included is really important to them, particularly for those first 2, for Alfie and for Brenda. They've had quite a difficult time. They've been anxious, they've been moved around. Alfie's moved family homes. So that stability and safety in school is really important for them, as well as feeling included, not feeling that, sure, they go to the school building, but they're excluded. I think having positive options for their future is crucial. Both Alfie and Brenda are coming up to a transition point. So feeling wanted and listened to at each stage is important. Also having their views and understanding what their options, what's their next likely placement, and will that placement fit their individual needs is really important for them. It's also important for them that school and parents, carers are on the same page. If there's tension between them, that really does cause anxiety and a difficult time for children, exacerbating any difficulties they may have due to their particular needs. Thanks, Chris. If we go on to the next one. And thinking about their parents, carers, so important. And we know that any parent or carer who has a child with special educational needs or a disability is already under some additional stress. So what works best for them is a placement where their child's cared for, where their child belongs, where their needs are met. I suppose I would describe it as the right shaped space for them. It may not be a perfect fit, but as long as it could be close enough with a real will to make things work for that child. I think for parents as well, thinking ahead, knowledge about the positive options for the next phase in good time is really important. Parents will worry, as the children will, particularly as they get older, about what's it going to be like going to secondary school? What's it going to be like post-16? What will it be like post-18? What are the options there? And crucially, coming into that decision making, of having known trusted key workers in school and the local authority. Thanks, Chris. And then thinking about what works for school staff, mainstream and special school staff. I think a really clear positive steer from leaders on inclusion. I think occasionally in schools you can get slightly mixed messages, not all schools at all. Some are absolutely clear about inclusion. Again, I'll come back to that a bit when I talk about government initiatives. I think suitable pathways for children are important. If it's very difficult for a child to be in all the mainstream classes, all the lessons all day long, having what is the nurture group? Is there a sort of slightly easier pathway for some children if that's appropriate without reducing the ambition for those children? We know that's not always easy, particularly with financial pressures on schools, but actually sometimes having the right pathway within a mainstream school for children is crucial. Also crucial is that third point, that good recruitment, professional development and retention of colleagues, that stability, collegiality and expertise. So stability of staffing is important, and professional development, particularly around these children, around their special educational needs and how best to adapt the curriculum and teaching and learning for them is crucial. I think a positive approach to working with all parents, and again, that point about funding, and I know we're going to hear more about that in the second part of this afternoon's session. Thanks, Chris. And then thinking about what helps provide that within the local area partnership, so that as much as possible, all schools and the local authority and other partners are on the same page. A clear cross-local authority policy about inclusion is important, which encompasses these things, that early diagnosis and early intervention, sufficient places, inclusive mainstream schools, an EHCP process which works in a timely way, a strong strategy and system within the local authority about planning for phased transfers. If you go back to thinking about those 3 children, when they transition will be really important. It's crucial that they get the best possible next placement. And that includes a positive post-16 offer, which is well supported. Thanks, Chris. And what helps provide that? Well, I think for local authority staff, really good annual training programme, both for local authority staff and for schools. I know in the busyness of working in a local authority in areas to do with SEND, it can be hard to carve out time for professional development, but I think it's really crucial and really helps with recruitment and retention for local authority staff. We also know that join up across the partners, across the local authority SEND team, social care team, children with disabilities team and the health partnership, working in the area, are really important for some of those children. If we think about Amina, health and education working together are going to be crucial. And again, across all of that, a positive approach to working with parents and schools. Thanks, Chris. So some of those, I think, some of you will be thinking, well, we do that already. And some of you might be thinking, oh, I don't have time to do that. Or is this just a chance to think a bit about that perspective from the children's point of view? But those points can fit into your strategy and into your priorities. They can fit into improvements you and your teams and your directorate are making so that they've got real longevity, those changes and developments, and that they stick, so that there's not, for instance, just one professional development afternoon and then nothing for 2 years. It needs to be part of a regular routine, a sort of drumbeat of development. And I think I have a question about optimising all the groups and partnerships you work within so that all those meetings that are in your diary are as positive and effective as possible and really help drive the agenda forward for our children. Thanks, Chris. Okay, I'm going to move on to what's the government saying and doing, which might influence placements over time. And I guess if I think back again to Alfie and Brenda, Alfie and Brenda should be able to be in mainstream schools with some adaptations, with some support and with the right culture and with staff with the right training. There are probably some areas in the country at the moment, it's probably inconsistent, where they might not manage to stay in mainstream schools and might be placed elsewhere, perhaps in a special school or in a unit for a time, expensive placements out of mainstream. So there's a really strong emphasis on inclusion in mainstream schools from the government. That comes through in the proposed Ofsted framework and via other government announcements and influence that I will talk a bit more about. Government's also talking about more input into early years, so early support, diagnosis and intervention. The Education Select Committee, which is a cross-party parliamentary group, is focusing on solutions for the national SEND system issues. And you will know that there's a curriculum and assessment review doing its first report in the next few months and then making further more firm proposals a bit later on. And I'm just going to say a little bit more about each of those. Thanks, Chris. So in October, 4 months ago, the government gave a response to a very critical audit of the SEND system. And the response they gave to tackling the known issues we all know about SEND and provision for children with SEND were stated here. They said they would strengthen accountability on mainstream settings to be inclusive, including through Ofsted. And I'll go into that in a bit more detail in a couple of slides. Supporting the mainstream workforce to increase their SEND expertise and encouraging schools to set up resource provisions or SEN units to increase capacity in mainstream schools. The second point, I think, it sounds a bit bureaucratic, but I actually think that's been really important. In the previous setup of the Department for Education, SEND and alternative provision was in a completely different set of teams from schools. So it felt like SEND wasn't the responsibility of schools. SEND and alternative provision now comes under the responsibility of the schools group. And I think that is helping drive forward some of the sort of language and initiatives coming through and bringing back, as in many places has always been the case, that responsibility for children with SEND to schools, to head teachers, to MAT CEOs. Thank you, Chris. They also said the curriculum assessment review would look at barriers which hold children with SEND back, and that does include looking at performance measures. So it'll be interesting to see what comes out of that. And 2 advisors have been appointed to the DFE, Christine Linehan, advisor on SEND, and Tom Rees on inclusion in mainstream schools. And I'm going to say something on the next slide about what Tom Rees said at a conference recently. He talked here about there's a lot of diversity within society and our school population, and a lot of what we categorise as special is normal and predictable. So it might be, if we think about the 3 children I described earlier, how much do we need to deem them to be different? He goes on to say, we want to move from a system based on perceived deficit to a system built on dignity, where we see all children and their differences as part of the inherent beauty of humankind. So again, thinking of our 3 children with the not their real names, the pictures we saw earlier, thinking them as part of the inherent beauty of humankind. And Tom highlighted key priorities for reform: improving classroom practices, fostering family partnerships, enhancing workforce capability, and creating enabling conditions within schools, all things that would work for all 3 of those children. I think we think about mainstream, particularly the first 2. And he urged people he was talking to shift the narrative around SEND from focusing on failures to identifying solutions. Thanks very much, Chris. Next slide. The Education Select Committee, I probably won't say too much about this, but they are reporting, looking at the wider SEND system. If we go on to the next slide. They're looking at these things, which I think you would probably all recognise as things we would want to happen, about how mainstream schools and other educational settings can be more inclusive, increasing capacity, the EHCP system, making provision more consistent between local authority areas. There's not really a way, apart from the Ofsted inspections, of sending local area partnerships, of looking at consistency, apart from, voluntary networks. But for instance, there isn't the same equivalent of a NPQH qualification for colleagues who work in SEND, or particularly, consistent training for colleagues. And the committee will also look at how SEND support's provided in other countries. Thanks, Chris. Next slide. So, and then I'm going to finish off just summarising briefly what Ofsted are saying in their proposed framework. They have a working definition of inclusion, which is here, that across the school's work, inclusive practices are secure, so that all pupils feel welcome, valued, and a sense of belonging to their school and community. So again, thinking back to Alfie, Brenda, Amina, making sure that they feel welcome, valued, and a strong sense of belonging. Thanks, Chris. So that, I think you will know that the framework has a number of sections. There will be one titled Inclusion, which will be reported on and have one of the 5 grades, if the 5 grades remain. And then actually supporting children with SEND is mentioned in almost every area. It's mentioned on 19 pages out of 30 in the framework. So it's absolutely woven in to each section. And that includes in leadership and management, including governance and curriculum, in developing teaching, and there's a section on inclusive teaching, on achievement, on attendance, and there's a section on inclusive attendance, and on personal development and well-being. So there is significantly more emphasis and explicit expectations in that framework, which is, I suspect it will shift a bit, but not very much, which will come into being in September. It's being piloted as we sit here. And if we move on to the next slide. So I think my kind of final message, and I'm going to answer questions if there are any in a moment, but just bearing children in mind, I think is really important in our work. Probably Alfie, Brenda and Amina aren't the most relevant to you, although they might be, but bearing in mind some known children you've worked with or worked on behalf of, holding them in mind as we make decisions is important. I also think for all our staff, thinking about developing your staff and the career pathway into your teams and upward for your teams is important. I think our colleagues across all our SEND teams do great work, and it's often underappreciated in the pressure of the system. So I think staff development is key. I think having some agreed inclusive principles and values is crucial, working across with partners and referring back to those. They will help steer decision making and planning. And I think the other thing in the busyness of what we do is managing time with your key stakeholders well. So both the regular scheduled meetings and individual meetings, managing that time well, making sure you have spaces in between, and using the key termly events well. Sometimes I hear from colleagues who say, well, I'm being inundated with questions or phone calls, but having kind of like surgery times or a rota of answering things is really helpful, I think, so that you can be proactive and optimize your efforts and those of your team. I think my message is bear the children in mind.
So thanks everyone for having me. It's really interesting to hear Annie's presentation, and I think really helpful to have in mind the children that we're doing all of this for. I think sometimes I get very entrenched in the finance side of things, and it's easy to forget that actually we're here to improve the outcomes for children. So yeah, let's definitely keep that in mind as we move forward. So my name's Emma. I'm a SEND and High Needs Block consultant. I've been working in this area as a consultant for about 15 years now, very much focused on deficit recovery and management of the high needs block over the past, certainly I would say 8 years, and looking at different ways of cost avoidance as well as saving, but certainly cost avoidance. And I've worked across lots of local authorities in London and the South East, so seen how things work in many different areas. So my heading for this presentation is a bit of a bait and switch, because I said the 5 no's, but really it's about a no with KNOW. And I'll come onto why I've done that towards the end of the presentation, but it links in with what Annie was saying actually about Tom Rees's view of special educational needs. So I'm going to focus on the high needs block budgets. I know there are others, but this is the focus for the presentation today. And just to say, I'm going to give you some hints. Some of you will already know this. There's no panacea. Unfortunately, I haven't got a magic bullet that's going to wipe off your deficit of the high needs block, but there are definitely things that I can do, and lots of authorities I've worked with where I've reduced the in-year overspend, as well as making an effect on reducing the cumulative deficit. One of the seminars that I attended, someone said that actually we talk about SEND budgets being overspent, but actually they're underfunded. So I am not going to talk about an overspend on the high needs block budget. I'm going to talk about it being underfunded. And I think it's a really important distinction, because we know that all of that funding has gone to children. This is not money that's been wasted. It's gone into schools. It's gone to support children. Annie mentioned about the developments that we're hoping come in from the DFE. Again, we're not really clear what that's going to be. I think, we have to sort of wait and see. Obviously, there's a number of authorities facing very significant deficits on their high needs block budget, and I'm hoping that there'll be some package in there to support those local authorities. Having said all of that, there is always scope to be more efficient, and I think if that's one thing that I've learned on my travels around different local authorities, is that we can always be more efficient about how we're spending that money, and thinking about how we make the best value for money choices in that spend on the high needs block. So the first no then is to know your spend. And probably all of you are thinking, well, yeah, obviously I already know that. But I think sometimes, in my experience, often heads of SEND and heads of finance don't get together, or if they do, they're not really focusing on where those expenses are happening, where the overspends or the underfunding is happening. And I think it's worth blocking out half a day for the heads of finance and SEND, and maybe the operational managers as well, to go through cost centres line by line. And sometimes that will be thinking about what those cost centres actually where the money is going from those cost centres. Sometimes the cost centres are an absolute muddle, and there's lots of historical things that come out of a cost centre for no apparent reason. And I would say it is really worth rationalising your cost centres and just being really clear about which cost centre is spending on which aspect of your high needs block budget. And that also then allows for improved budget monitoring and forecasting. So of course, you can then drill down much more about where the money's going and why there are challenges in those particular areas. It makes it much easier to see. So for example, lots of authorities that I come across have transport that's allocated to an AP cost centre, or they have all out of borough costs coming from one cost code, but it makes it very hard to see if it's an out of borough independent provision or an out of borough maintained provision, which obviously makes a big difference in terms of cost. And certainly for London authorities, it might be perfectly natural for that child to go to the next borough's school because that's actually their nearest school. So it's really unpicking all of those elements. So is it legit? So this question is really about whether the funding that's coming out of the high needs block should actually be coming out of the high needs block. And I can almost guarantee that there'll be some little anomaly, sometimes a big anomaly, of funding that's coming out of the high needs block that actually should be coming out of a different budget, whether that's the general fund, whether it's your BSG, could be all number of other options. So thinking about, are these statutory assessment costs that should not be coming out of the high needs block? So things like that. Again, I think sitting down across finance and send and really unpicking what all of those spends are really, really helps. And then it may seem obvious, but again, I think it's about putting time aside to look at the last 3 years of expenditure and really looking at those patterns. So frequently, what I'm finding more and more over the past few years is that mainstream budgets are overspent. And that's because mainstream schools and settings are dealing with more and more children with higher and higher complexity of needs. And what that means is that one-off agreements are being put into place for those children, which is impossible to predict, and that there isn't a consistent, transparent and fair process for allocating those additional costs. So that's something that we'll come on to, but I think it's just really thinking about those areas where it's been underfunded and therefore is going over the budget that's been agreed. There may also be other things happening around outcomes from tribunals, lack of special school places or specialist places in resource provisions or SEN units. Looking at whether over those 3 years or 5 years, if you've got that data, does the overspend increase year on year, or does it stay the same? Does it fluctuate? So all of those give you an indication of what might be happening, and it's worth doing some unpicking. So know your children. And one thing, I've worked in local authorities that are part of the safety valve, as well as local authorities that are part of delivering better value. And one of the things that we do as part of the Delivering Better Value programme is deep dives. So we'll look at maybe 30 to 50 cases of young people, and we really drill down into those cases and look at whether we think they need an EHCP, whether we think they're in the right provision for that child, and what we think we could have done earlier to support that child in a better way to improve their outcomes and perhaps also make an impact on spend across the high needs block. So those deep dives with a range of partners, with health, with public health, with your speech and language therapists, with your case officers, your early years providers, your post-16 providers. That is time so well spent if you can find 2 hours and really workshop some of those children. made a massive difference. One of the DBV authorities I worked with, actually there were a number of different practices that they changed immediately following those deep dives. They were like, we don't even need DBV money to do this. We can make these changes already. So one example was we noticed that the early years settings were struggling with the number of EHCP assessments they were being asked to do by schools at that transition point. So we introduced transition funding. So all children that had received SENDIF funding in early years, that money would automatically be passported to schools from the high needs block for the first 2 terms in reception, so that the school had time to go through 2 rounds of assess plan do review and could then decide whether that child needed an EHCP or not. So that's just one of the effects that came out of those deep dives, and I think that's really, really helpful. Obviously, data and projections are a really big part of understanding your high needs block, the expectations on it, as well as the spend. And the sorts of things that I look at are the banding. So have you got a really clear banding system that works across all settings, where you understand if you might have children who we might expect to be at a special school, but for whatever reason, whether that's parental preference, whether it's lack of places in special school, if that child is in mainstream, the mainstream school are getting an appropriate level of funding to meet the needs of that child, not just the highest level that's been allocated or decided for mainstream schools. So I think that's really important. Again, referring back to what I was saying about the one-off agreements, the more one-off agreements you have, the more out of control your budget is. So it's really important that you have a banding system that can accommodate what's the reality of what's happening in your schools and settings. The other way that a banding system helps, I find, is with projection data. So you can look at the number of children you have, say, with autism in your schools across your borough, but that doesn't tell you the level of need. So if you have a really good banding system, you can say, oh, actually, if your highest band is band 6, we've got, 30% of our children with autism are band 6, whereas 50% are band 3. That gives you an idea of what sort of provision you're going to need to put in place to meet the needs of those children with autism. Okay. So know your settings. So again, this is really important, and I think reflects what Annie was saying about bringing in, the work that the DFE are doing now about thinking across that continuum of need. So how do we maximise our inclusion in mainstream schools? And I think this is one of the key drivers for keeping costs under control, but also maximising the life chances of our children and young people who we want to be able to go out into that world, mix with their peers, have friendships and support groups, and have a meaningful adult life. So I think it's really, really important that we think about how we make mainstream schools and settings as accessible as possible. And I suppose when I look at that, what I'm looking at is central support. So whether that's from the local authority or from other schools, it might be special schools, it might be schools with resource provision, could be delivered in a number of ways. But I think that central support is so, so important, and is really one of the things that we know is lacking currently because of reduced budgets. It's just made it harder and harder to meet those needs from central support services, which have been just cut back to the bone. But I think it's a really useful investment, and so many schools, when I go in and visit and talk to the head teachers, what they're saying is they just want some reliable autism support, behaviour support, speech and language therapist support, all of those kind of things. They want to know when those professionals are coming in, how many days that they've got allocated per term or per week or whatever. I just think it helps the school plan and manage all the things that are going on in that setting. Send capital funding as well, I think, is really useful. If your local authority still has some send capital funding, I think it can be really helpful to think about creating sensory spaces indoors and outdoors. It can be used for noise reduction panels in dining halls and assembly halls, things that make mainstream schools just so much more accessible for all of our neurodiverse children in particular, but also just thinking about how we just make everyone welcome in our mainstream settings. And one thing that I always really push in local authorities is to include early years and PVI settings in that as well, because I think so important that we start off our children and our professionals with an expectation that Universal can meet their child's needs. So I think that's really important to include those settings as well. Where you might want to think about inclusion funding. So when I talk about inclusion funding, what I'm talking about here are schools that are very inclusive, who might then find that their finances are detrimentally affected by their levels of inclusion, whereas the school down the road that is perhaps less inclusive is possibly sitting on a nice reserve. And that's one of the challenges, I think, if you're looking at your banding, is if you increase the top up levels to your banding, then all schools benefit. Whereas actually, if you look at some inclusion funding, which might be if a school has has more children with EHCPs than the local authority average, they would get some additional funding, some inclusion funding per child, perhaps on top of the top ups that they're getting for those children, to support them and recognise the inclusivity that they have in their school. So there's a number of different ways of doing that. I think one of the things that's really important there, though, is that you are confident in your panel processes, that your panel can hold the line on where the threshold for EHCPs is, because otherwise you suddenly find that there's a clamour for applying for more and more EHCPs. So I think there's a real balance there. So that was just a little health check there. I am always a really strong advocate of that commissioning approach. This is assess, plan, do, review, but it's really thinking that through with all of your settings. So as the local authority, you are the commissioner of that provision. So even with your academies, if they've got a resource provision, if they've got SEN units, if you're looking at specialist schools, it's really important that you understand what you're commissioning. And this is, goes back to the what I was saying about data and projections. You've got to understand what provision you need and then what you're asking schools to deliver. And I think within that commissioning framework, it's being really clear what your expectations of schools are. It's being really clear about that quality assurance of the provision that you're paying for, that what you want to see for that from that top up. But equally, it's about setting out how you can support the schools and the settings to deliver that provision as well. So the support that you're offering. So it's really being clear about that partnership approach. So know your gaps is number 4. So this is going back to what I said in number 1 about knowing your spend. So it's thinking about those patterns that you've identified and thinking, what is this telling us about what we are or are not doing, or what we do or do not have in the local authority across the borough that's causing those pinch points and those pressure points. So if your special schools are all full and you want to create more resource-based provision, is that possible? Or have the schools got an appetite to do that? If not, how are you building capacity in mainstream to accommodate those higher needs? Or you might be doing all of those things. Also, I think it's really important to think about what alternative provision you have in place and what your pupil referral unit is being used for. So I think often pupil referral units are kind of a bit of a mixed approach, really, because sometimes they are supporting pupils with SEMH needs, they're supporting pupils with EHCPs, but somehow that the funding for that EHCP, the needs just could not be met in the mainstream school. So I think there's some real unpicking about who is in your alternative provision and your PRU, and really thinking about what would be the best type of provision for those children with SEMH in particular, but also about that genuine thinking about an alternative offer. So what do you need to provide that's different from a formal curriculum for those children who really cannot cope with a formal curriculum? So really thinking about the type of offer you have. And stakeholders will tell you what the problem is. And I'm sure all of you will be well aware of that. I am really, really keen on listening to all the stakeholders. So whether that's case officer staff in the local authority, other local authority staff, whether it's therapists, whether it's EPs, whether it's parent carers, whether it's teachers, resource-based leads, SENCOs, early years staff, head teachers, they all will tell you something about what you need to do. And I think if you listen and you pull all of that together with your data and projections, you're going to get a really clear idea of what it is, how you can solve the challenges that you're facing. So I would really urge everybody. I know sometimes it's really hard and there's lots of hard conversations that we have and lots of hard things that we have to listen to, but all of those views are really valid and help us to find a way forward. So one example is in a local authority I was recently working in, schools were telling me that they want to commission their own speech and language therapy rather than have a centrally commissioned service. And when I did a bit more digging about that, what it turns out is that actually the schools just want to know what day their speech and language therapist is coming in. They want to know who the speech and language therapist is, and they want to know that if that therapist is off on sick leave or on maternity leave or whatever it is, that their work is covered. Now, actually, as the local authority, we can commission a service that delivers that. And if we commission that centrally, we know that we can get the best value for money rather than schools individually commissioning speech and language therapy. So I think there are things like that where it's really important and really, really helpful to listen to your stakeholders. And then know your team. And by team, I mean the widest team in the widest sense. So how are your partners contributing? Annie mentioned it, but I think as well, it's really worth thinking about what contributions health are making, what contributions public health are making, early help. All of those services are part of meeting the needs of vulnerable children, some of whom will have special educational needs and disabilities. So I would want to know, are public health staff delivering around communication needs? Are they thinking about what's happening at the 2.5-year-old health check? Are they signposting parents about what good communication looks like? It's so important that at those very earliest stages, our children are receiving good communication skills from parents and from professionals so that by the time they start school, they don't need a speech and language therapist. So things like that are really, really important to making sure that we're getting the children the support that they need. And do the right people come together at the right time with the right focus? So as I was saying before about heads of finance and head of SEND, coming together and having a really focused conversation. So again, one of the things that I do in lots of authorities is set up regular, perhaps fortnightly, perhaps monthly meetings between the head of SEND and head of finance to focus on key actions around that deficit recovery plan or the DSG management plan, and making sure that there are smart targets that are actionable and that they have capacity to move those forward in between meetings. So the reason that I did my little bait and switch with the 5 no's was really because I like to focus on the positive. So this comes back to what Annie was saying about Tom Rees's view on thinking about special educational needs and disabilities in our community, is focus on the positive and what you can do rather than the negative. People think they like rules, but I think it's much better to move forward thinking in a solution focused way. I would say that time taken out of your day of your key heads of service, heads of finance, heads of education, or heads of SEND will actually just reap so many rewards. And I think looking at high needs block deficits, as I do day in, day out, it does feel like a Herculean task to try and manage, the budget that we have in year, as well as trying to recover some of that deficit. But it's that old adage of eating the elephant. It's just doing it one bit at a time. And I think it's really important that we acknowledge it's a huge task, and it's not easy. But there are things that you can do, and just bit by bit, all of those little bits make a difference. So that's me done. Thank you, Tabby.